Thanks to Supremacy World War III for sponsoring this video. This video is an adaptation of my entry in Native Oak's anthology tale, Something Like Philosophy. Recently, I reread the entry and I was reminded about how damn interesting World War II bomber combat was. Above all else, it was a deadly game. What was it like trying to survive in such a hostile environment, where the lack of oxygen alone would be enough to kill a man? Today, we're looking at the challenges American bomber crews faced in the frozen hell of 30,000 feet. Supremacy World War III is a free online PvP strategy game set in the modern era. Command powerful armies, master the art of global domination, and outthink up to 99 real opponents in an all-out struggle for control. Use cutting-edge military tech from tanks and jets to submarines and missiles to crush your rivals and rise as the world's ultimate superpower. Form alliances, launch surprise attacks, and plan your path to victory in campaigns that can last for weeks. Every move counts and every decision shapes the fate of the world. Playing on different devices? No problem. Supremacy World War III supports full cross-platform play, so you and your friends can conquer together whether you're on PC or mobile. And here's the kicker, if you join using my exclusive code within the next 30 days, you'll unlock a bomber worth $25. A devastating powerhouse that'll send your enemies running for cover. Don't miss out on this edge before the fight begins. And speaking of bombers, let's rewind the clock back to the bombers of World War II. While Zeppelins were the first to carry out strategic bombing en masse in the First World War, it wasn't until the Second World War that it evolved into a vital cog in the Allied war-winning strategy. Both the Axis and Allies employed strategic bombing. However, the Royal Air Force and US Army Air Corps envisioned a 24-hour bombing campaign, with the British bombing at night and the American missions taking place during day. The most notable examples of strategic bombing came from the 8th Air Force stationed in England between 1942 and 1945. Their campaign has been covered in depth across media, from non-fiction publications to TV-based documentaries. I'm not trying to delve into specific missions or the strategic big picture of the campaign, as more versed creators like Lord Hardthrasher have done that amazingly. I really want to go into what it meant to be a crewman inside the aluminum tubes that were World War II bombers. It was a new kind of warfare, far removed from the low-altitude hand-drop bombs from a biplane in 1914. Aircrews from all walks of life, typically aged between 19 and 25, were called upon to fly in the most unforgiving aerial environment known to man by that time, the skies of 30,000 feet. The 8th Air Force in particular, which operated both the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator for long-range bombing missions over Europe, elected to sortie during daylight hours with the thought that this would improve accuracy. To give the bombers the best chance of avoiding ground fire, their missions were flown at the upper reaches of the aircraft's service ceiling, typically between 20 and 30,000 feet. The appearance of the sky dramatically changes at altitude. Its normal light blue that we see on the ground becomes a deep indigo, sometimes exposing stars normally unseen during daylight hours. Most clouds cluster far below in the thicker air of the troposphere, and cities become swaths of black and gray among checkerboards of green and brown pastures. Such a serene yet alien environment on its own is unsuitable for human life without aid from specialized equipment. Most aircraft today that fly at these heights are pressurized, which allows for passengers and crew to enjoy their flight in conditions suitable for survival. Bombers of the era didn't afford such luxuries and were full of openings that exposed the crew to the elements. When grazing the lower end of the stratosphere, one can expect temperatures ranging from -40 to -70 degrees Fahrenheit. At such temperatures, skin easily sticks to metal, saliva freezes solid, and frostbite can take hold in seconds. To combat the cold, an airman would need 4, sometimes 5 layers of clothing, often including an electrically heated set of coveralls known as the F-1 Blue Bunny. The blue coveralls were similar in composition to modern electric blankets, with heating wires coiling up and down the length of the suit. When the F-1s worked, they afforded heat that was enough to induce sweating. If the power of the suit was cut or the circuits broke, the now wet airman would have to deal with being cold and damp. The higher one goes into the upper atmosphere, the less available oxygen becomes. When flying at altitude akin to the summit of Mount Everest, the lack of oxygen can induce hypoxia. Within moments, confusion, lack of coordination, and poor judgment begin, followed by the loss of consciousness. Oxygen masks connected to bottles on the bomber were a necessity. Yet, even this was an imperfect system. The aforementioned cold caused the airmen's exhaled breath to freeze inside the mask or valves, blocking the flow of oxygen. As the ice would build up, less and less oxygen would be provided to the crewman, who may not even be aware that his flow is being disrupted until becoming incapacitated. Not only would breathing be a challenge to overcome, but at lower outside pressures, the human bladder is less capable of retaining urine. Such incontinence could lead to urine freezing to the skin beneath clothing, or in some cases, freeze the airman's boot to the bomber's floor. Beneath several layers of thick clothing and in sub-zero temperatures, some airmen would resort to tying strings around their parts to aid in shrinkages so common to the conditions. Needless to say, survival in a bomber at altitude is a hazardous game without being shot at. The Boeing B-17 was nicknamed the Flying Fortress by a reporter of the Seattle Times upon seeing its bristling firepower and metallic construction. The 30 caliber machine guns, which were later upgraded to 50 calibers, were positioned around the B-17 to ward off fighter attacks from any angle. The B-17E and F, the first models to see action with the 8th Air Force, had no less than 10 50 caliber machine guns. Notably, 2 were mounted in a Sperry ball turret slung under the belly of the fort. The power turret was large enough for a single gunner who would lay in a hunched position in the confined space. With his knees above his head and the machine guns recoiling mere inches from his face, the ball turret was a less than desirable position to man. The other heavy bomber in use by the 8th Air Force was the consolidated B-24 Liberator. The Liberator, by all accounts, was the superior aircraft technologically. While it was still unpressurized like the B-17, it could carry a larger bomb load, which was 5,000 pounds versus the B-17's 4,000 pounds for long-range missions. It had a higher top speed and featured a retractable ball turret which curtailed risk to the gunner. Both bombers were equipped with the Norden bomb sight, often advertised to be able to drop a bomb within a pickle barrel from altitude. However, the reality of the sight was much less spectacular. Again, Lord Hardthrasher's video on the subject is a must-watch. Initially, it was thought that the bombers were well defended enough to conduct raids without escort fighters. However, the experiences of 1942 and 1943 quickly proved the theory false. While the extreme altitude did avoid the majority of smaller anti-aircraft guns such as the 20mm Flak 38, the bombers were still vulnerable to interceptor aircraft like the Bf-109 and the high-velocity 88mm guns. Despite flying tight box formations to maximize coverage among aircraft, attrition from German fighter attacks and ground fire lost the 8th Air Force 148 bombers and 1,500 men in the week of October 8, 1943 alone. This would be dubbed Black Week, with the worst day, October 14th, gaining the title Black Thursday. The 14th was an especially dark day for the 8th Air Force, with 60 bombers being lost out of a 200-strong force in the ill-fated Schweinfurt ball-bearing plant raid. The title, Flying Fortress, carries with it an implication of invincibility. However, the unpressurized B-17 had little protection in the open air against enemy fire. Despite its heavy firepower, engaging an incoming fighter with frontal closure rates of up to 600 miles per hour would only provide a gunner with seconds to line up a shot. The skin of the B-17 and 24 had no armor whatsoever. The thin aluminum, similar to what one might find in a modern soda can, wouldn't stand up to the sharp jab of a blade, let alone 1,000-degree steel fragments from an exploding flak round. Once inside the bomber, fragments or bullets would easily chew into engine components, fuel lines, control cables, and of course, flesh and bone. In addition to their heavy leather flying clothes, aircrew quickly adopted flak jackets and steel helmets to offer some reprieve from the brutal lead flying through the air. Unlike a fighter, the bombers had to hold their defensive box formations lest a mid-air collision occur. Only when the lead bomber ordered soft turns or altitude changes would the entire formation shift. From the ground, anti-aircraft gunners would have little trouble acquiring straight lines of contrails high overhead. Sometimes hundreds of bombers would form up and blot out the sky with white trails. An easy target. Especially when flak batteries were aided by early radars like the FUMG-38 that would direct the gun's optical firing control systems. If all else failed and the bomber wasn't going to make it home, the crew had one option: bailing out. Unlike modern bombers that are equipped with rocket-powered ejection seats, World War II bomber crews were forced to navigate through the aircraft to an opening, be it a hatch, gunport, or even the bomb bay. Oftentimes, the departed bomber would be tumbling or in a spin, making such a trek impossible given the severe gravity forces applied. In the worst of spins, the centrifugal forces were intense enough to easily pin a man inside the wall of the fuselage. There are primarily two types of gravity forces experienced in an aircraft: positive and negative Gs, as they are called in the aviation community. For reference, we're typically experiencing 1G in our day-to-day lives. Humans can comfortably handle positive G forces in which the force of gravity increases down on us. A good example of positive Gs is a loop on a roller coaster. In some coasters, riders can experience up to 3 Gs. Beyond that, blood begins to have trouble traveling to the brain. The lack of blood begins to cause vision to go gray. For most people, 3 or 4 Gs can have this effect. Sustaining 4 and beyond can cause an untrained person's vision to go black and eventually induce unconsciousness. Sustaining 6 Gs and beyond eventually becomes fatal due to the lack of circulation to the brain. Negative G forces, or eyeball out Gs, are the inverse, in which our organs, blood, and muscles are forced upwards. The blood rushing to one's head can often be painful when experiencing more than one negative G. In a spinning bomber, the centrifugal forces pinning a man to the wall could cause crewmen in certain positions to experience negative Gs as they are thrust forward against their restraints. As the spin intensifies, aerodynamic effects coupled with G forces often cause the already compromised bombers to break up completely. Now, getting out of the bomber is just the first part of making it to the ground. Falling from 30,000 feet to the ground generally takes about 2.5 minutes. In that time, the airman is subjected to all sorts of violence between the bombers and the Germans on Mother Earth. Shells flying up from the ground, bombs dropped from the bombers, and wayward fighters were all still a factor. While engaging paratroopers under canopy is allowed, it is generally considered a war crime to attack a bailed-out aircrew. Though, given history is full of rule breakers, it's important to note that those who had just been bombed are not apt to be merciful towards those who just bombed them. Upon touching down, a bailed-out airman would expect to be immediately captured and sent to a prisoner of war camp known as a Stalag, be killed in a shootout with the local populace, or be one of the lucky ones and find friendly resistance forces. Should a bomber crew actually make it to their target, they would have to rely on the bombardier huddled over the famous Norden bomb sight in the nose. The Norden M-series bomb sight was essentially a mechanical computer coupled with a telescopic sight that would calculate a bombing solution based on the aircraft's speed, altitude, and direction. While pre-war testing in a closed environment suggested that the Norden could land a bomb within a 75-foot diameter target, real-world conditions would see the mechanical wonder offering a less than ideal effect. Dirty brushes in the sight's mechanism coupled with faulty circuits often caused the bombs to fall well off target. This was only compounded by the aircraft's slight and unavoidable rolling and pitching, as well as varied wind conditions that affected the bombs during fall. Even if the bombs were accurate enough to impact their targets, the standard AN M57 250-pound bomb would do little to destroy heavy machinery in factories or railroad facilities. The lack of effectiveness required return missions to strike the same targets. Notably, the city of Bremen, which primarily housed shipyards and U-boat pens, was bombed 13 times by the 8th Air Force alone. Regardless of effectiveness, the bombers on mission would have to turn for home and endure the gauntlet once more once they had their run-in. Only when out of enemy airspace over the English Channel would the defensive gunners breathe a sigh of relief. If a bomber was heavily damaged and running on fewer engines than when they took off, it was common for unnecessary weight to be shed. Excess ammunition, machine guns, the ball turret, and even the expensive Norden bomb sight could be jettisoned from the B-17 to save weight. Landing in a B-17 or 24 was a straightforward affair for most trained aviators of the Army Air Corps, but when a bomber was damaged, oftentimes the hydraulic system which governed the lowering of flaps and landing gear was rendered non-functional. Luckily for the crew, the B-17 had a pretty decent wheels-up landing characteristic. Ideally, the ball turret would have been jettisoned by this point to create a smooth landing surface across the bomber's belly, since landing wheels up with the ball in place could make for more structural damage on touchdown. When retracted, the landing gears still protruded from their wells. On impact with the ground, the free-spinning tires could absorb some of the shock and smooth out an otherwise scraping bomber. As soon as the aircraft would come to a stop, the most critically damaged bombers would be swarmed by medical and maintenance personnel. The most severely wounded crewmen would be prioritized for care, oftentimes having their mangled bodies lifted out of the bombers on stretchers. Clarence Wickett of the 392nd Bombardment Group was witness to a casualty being carried away from a ravaged bomber.
I remember the first casualty I saw. I think he was a crew chief, a red-haired fellow. They were bringing out of the plane on a stretcher. The blanket covering him caught on a jagged edge coming off and exposed his stomach and intestines. He was shot up bad. I never went over to another plane to see any wounded individual.
Able-bodied crew were snapped up by jeeps and taken away, making room for the ground crew to immediately begin assessing and repairing damage. After all, they had to do it again the next day. Early in the war, the repetition of carnage was to wreak havoc on the minds and bodies of the 8th Air Force crew 25 times. The magical 25th mission was a goal that so many aimed for, but few would achieve before being wounded, killed, or captured. The odds were further stacked against air crews as, in 1944, the minimum tour requirement of missions rose to 30, bringing morale down even further. Over the course of its operations, the 8th Air Force alone suffered 47,000 dead, wounded, and missing, totaling almost half of the entirety of the Army Air Corps' casualties. Yet, the 8th Air Force never broke in a miraculous showing of tenacity rarely seen since. Even when morale was at its worst, these men of 18 to 25 would go back up at the drop of a hat. Ball Turret Gunner Staff Sergeant Shorty Gordon was one of thousands of flyers who never threw in the towel.
Shorty hasn't missed a mission yet. His feet have been frozen and his electrically heated baby blue jumper has failed him at 45 degrees below zero. He's had to work all night inside the wing of a fortress and go up to fight the Luftwaffe the following day. He has had to beg, wheedle, or steal his way to a gun position in another ship when his own was out of commission. He's worked on frozen guns at 24,000 feet while fighters were boring in and flesh was tearing off his fingers each time he touched his guns to coax them back into action. But he hasn't missed a mission yet.
Also motivated to return home in a shot-up B-24 was John Curico of the 458th Bomb Group. When on a raid over Kiel, Germany, his B-24 was severely damaged by flak. Two options presented to the crew. The safest being a hike to Sweden, which would have meant landing in a neutral territory. The second option, which was more risky, was to limp home to England. Per Curico's notes on the Kiel raid, made it back to base because Navigator had a date. Well, that was a heavy one. Thanks for sticking through it with me. And I want to thank the team over at Supremacy World War III once again for sponsoring the video. Remember, if you sign up in the next 30 days, you'll receive a free starter pack including an elite bomber to use in this awesome PvP strategy game. Now, let's see that roll of patrons. Special thanks to Captain Fantastic, Deuce, Ghoul, Iron, Jake Fuentes, Kodai, Private Petey, Aspen, Weefy, Boats FG, Strider1, Fox2, and Caleb Corey. Have a good one now.
So